This is Singapore, a tiny island covering just 600 square kilometers in Southeast Asia. Looking at its topical wealth and extravagance, it's hard to believe that it was once the scene of the largest surrender of the British Army ever recorded in history. Sandwiched between Malaysia and Indonesia in Southeast Asia, this sovereign island nation was and still remains the gateway to the rest of Asia. If one controls Singapore, they could control a vast majority of the Far East. The British Empire had always been interested in Singapore, as it was on the sea routes linking China and Europe. In 1867, this country became the crown colony and major base of the British Empire in Southeast Asia. The significant position of Singapore made it a desirable prey to Japan too. With Singapore in hand, the Japanese Empire would rule the major port to expand and reinforce its influence on other areas. Thus, a scramble between the two great powers was unavoidable, leading to the Battle of Singapore. This fierce fight took place in the Southeast Asian theater of World War II between the Japanese and British military from 8 to 15 February in 1942. Invasion of Malaya. Japan commenced its invasion of Southeast Asia and the Southwest Pacific by assaulting Thailand and forcing the government to lend its border to attack other countries in Southeast Asia. And the next targets are Malay Peninsula and Singapore. At noon on the 8th of December, British Admiral Thomas Phillip led two battleships to destroy the Japanese amphibious troops, but encountered a fierce defeat that took his life. The Japanese gained sea supremacy and terminated the supply lines for British troops on land, forcing them to flee to the south and retreat to Singapore. Over a month later, the last Allied forces retreated from Malay Peninsula, and Allied engineers blew a hole in the causeway, linking Johor, a state in the south of the Malay Peninsula, and Singapore. Some Japanese soldiers were disguised as civilians to intrude into Singapore. After 2 months, the battle ended with a complete victory of Japan, and the next target was Singapore. Initial Japanese landings. On February 8th in 1942, Yamashita's heavy guns laid down a barrage of 88,000 shells along the entire length of the Johor Strait, cutting telephone lines and effectively isolating forward units from rear areas. Fierce fighting raged throughout the day, with their superiority in artillery, aircraft, and intelligence, as well as the increasing number of amphibious forces, the Japanese gradually dominated. Further fighting followed throughout the dawn of the 9th of February, and the Australians either retreated or were seized. By the end of the day, more than 10,000 Japanese soldiers were in Singapore. Air Wars. When the Japanese attacked, the only hope of the Allies was the 232nd Squadron Royal Air Force, RAF, and the best aircraft were only 10 Hawker Hurricane fighters available in Singapore. However, the worst thing was that the Allied Air Force was outplayed by the quantity and quality of Japanese aircraft such as the Mitsubishi A6M0 and two long-range bombers called Mitsubishi G3M, codenamed Nell by the Allies, and Mitsubishi G4M with codename Betty. The air raids never paused until dusk on February 8th. The remaining flyable Hurricanes were withdrawn to Palembang, Sumatra. After that, no Allied aircraft were ever seen again over Singapore. The Japanese had achieved complete air supremacy. The Battle of Kranji. The Battle of Kranji was the second stage of the Empire of Japan's plan for the invasion of Singapore to breach the Jurong-Kranji defense line as part of their southward thrust towards the heart of Singapore City. The shoreline between the Kranji River and the Johor-Singapore Causeway was defended by the Australian 27th Brigade, led by Brigadier Duncan Maxwell. On February 10th, while leading the Johor Straits, the Japanese forces suffered stiff resistance. Oil from petrol tanks near Sungai Mandai Keshil was set alight and spilled into the straits and Kranji coastline, causing hundreds of casualties. Due to the heavy loss, they nearly aborted the operation. However, a series of miscommunications caused the Allied forces to withdraw the defensive line, Jurong-Kranji, which allowed the Japanese to swiftly gain strategic footholds. Japanese breakthrough. The withdrawal of Allied troops from the Kranji enabled the Imperial Japanese tank-armored forces to land ashore. Later on February 11th, with severe shortage of Japanese supplies, General Yamashita made an attempt to bluff Percival to surrender, asking him to give up his meaningless and desperate resistance. By this stage, the fighting strength of the 22nd Brigade had been significantly reduced to a few hundred, and the Japanese had captured the Bukit Timah area, including the Allies' main food and fuel supply depots. 2 days later, worrying about continual failures, Allied senior officers advised Percival to surrender to reduce civilian casualties, but refused. Alexandra Hospital Massacre. At about 1 p.m. on February 14th, the Japanese raged through the Alexandra Barracks Hospital and killed doctors, nurses, and even patients. A British lieutenant acting as an envoy with a white flag approached the Japanese forces, but was killed with a bayonet. The next day, about 200 male medical staff and patients, some injured, were forced to walk 400 meters to an industrial area. They were all brutally stabbed to death with a bayonet. Fall of Singapore. On morning February 15th, 1942, the first day of the Lunar New Year, Singapore was suffocated in smoke and fire. The Japanese penetrated the last perimeter of the Allies. By this stage, the Allies ran out of rations and military supplies. The anti-aircraft guns were almost out of ammunition and were unable to disrupt Japanese air attacks, which were causing heavy casualties in the city center. At 9:30, Percival held a conference at Fort Canning with his senior commanders to decide whether to counterattack or surrender. After the heated argument and recrimination, all present agreed that no counterattack was possible. Percival opted for surrender. All military forces in Singapore surrendered unconditionally. Aftermath. The Japanese captured 50,000 prisoners in Singapore, bringing the total number of prisoners captured from December 8th to 120,000. More than a third of the prisoners did not survive the war, and those who did would bear physical and mental scars for the rest of their lives. The Japanese occupation in Singapore would not end until their surrender to the Allies on August 15, 1945. The formal signing of the surrender instrument was held at the City Hall, Singapore on September 12, 1945. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more videos on history.